Let me start introducing first Professor Jacek Kugler. It's a pleasure of having him here. I had the great honor of making his acquaintance when I was doing my Ph.D. He made me study a lot more than I actually wanted to, but that's okay. And I also like to, well, he's a professor of international relations in Claremont Graduate University. He's an expert on world politics, which is basically conflict resolution. He helped develop a theory that challenged the notion of how countries can achieve and maintain stability and peace throughout the period, called prime transitions. And I also like to introduce VanDyck Silveira. He's the CEO of Trevisan School of Business here in São Paulo. Also, I had the pleasure of making his acquaintance when I was doing my undergraduate studies at IBMEC, then now INSPER. So with that in mind, I would defer this part of the debate to Jacek, and basically we'll do in a three-part. First one is Jacek showcasing his point of view on what's going on with the conflict. Then I have prepared a couple of 4 questions that we can debate, and then we will open to Q&A. So Jacek, please.
Just a second, Hugh, I think you should do an introduction in Portuguese, because there might be people here who are not fluent in Portuguese. I don't know if the translation is going on.
It's going on as we speak.
Oh, good.
But I can do it. No problem at all. Então eu vou só aqui seguindo o que o VanDyck sugeriu. Eu gostaria de fazer as apresentações, as devidas apresentações. Jacek é um professor da universidade onde eu fiz minha pós-graduação, tanto eu quanto o VanDyck. Ele é um dos experts e cientistas políticos mais renomados na parte de resolução de conflito e manutenção de paz. Desenvolveu uma teoria que na década de 70 foi a grande oposição ao que estava em voga, que é justamente determinando quais são as condições ideais para mais de um país atingir, ou melhor, mais de 2 superpotências atingir e manter paz e estabilidade ao longo do tempo. O VanDyck eu tive o prazer também de conhecer como aluno, na época que eu estava fazendo minha faculdade de economia na IBMEC, hoje INSPER, e eu posso dizer que também foi o responsável por eu ter me ausentado alguns anos do meu doutorado. Então, a forma a qual a gente optou por seguir nesse debate seria, primeiramente, uma exposição do Jacek sobre o conflito e perspectivas pós-conflito, quando isso acontecer. Depois a gente vai fazer um pequeno debate com alguns temas, e aí eu abro para perguntas e respostas. Com isso em mente, eu gostaria de passar a palavra para o Jacek. Jacek, please, the floor is all yours.
Well, I'm very pleased to be here and honored to be invited by my ex-students. Okay, so let's sort of talk about what's happening right now. Could you get me slide 2, please? Okay. This slide gives you the global structure. What's important about this is that for the first time since the collapse of the Soviet Union, there is a conflict over global politics. All of the previous conflicts were largely regional. So a contest over the Middle East, if it went one way or the other, would alter the international arrangement by no more than 5%, both in terms of population and in terms of overall capabilities. But if you look at this map, see that big red area plus the green area to the side, that's what's called Eurasia. And that includes China, Russia, and Europe. And looking at that structure alone, you have more than 50% of the total population and a little bit over 60% of the total GDP. If you were to add India to that, that approximates 60. So to a large degree, he controls Eurasia, controls the international system. So the current conflict over Ukraine is far more than any of the conflicts that we have witnessed before. And that is largely because of the importance of any shift in this area. So if Europe were to shift towards what I've drawn here in red, you can see that the Western capabilities would drop by more than half, and the United States would be substantially smaller than China and Russia, or would be in sort of Western dominance would be basically for practical purposes over. If you also compare China to United States, they're approximately the same right now. So the post-World War II dominance that was established after World War II is now in peril because it now requires Europe to a large degree to side with the United States. And eventually we'll talk a little bit more about India. Next slide, please. This is Ukraine. And what I did here is I drew the population proportions in Ukraine. So we get some understanding of what the Russians are contesting or wishing to contest. So notice that the bottom side is Crimea, which has been annexed to Russia. That actually has over 67% of the population is Russian. So it is not surprising that there was not much resistance. And if you have paid attention from the last 8 years to this particular confrontation, there hasn't been much terrorist activity or serious military internal activity within the Ukraine. It's not because the Russians are so efficient, it's because there are not that many Ukrainians that basically want to contest the current status of Crimea. And if you look to your right, that's Donetsk, okay? And that, again, big red area. And that is, again, highly populated by Russians, because remember, Ukraine was part of the Soviet Union. And in that section, the Russians are a majority. And then the question becomes, do you want to be a majority within the Soviet, within Russia, or do you want to be a majority, a minority within Ukraine? The rest of Ukraine, the blue area, is heavily Ukrainian, all the way from 80% to the left to about 75% to the right. And those little bluish areas which says plurality is the Ukrainians are a majority, plus all kinds of other groups, and the Russians are a minority. So if you're sort of thinking in terms of rational actors, okay, most of people prior to this conflict expected Russia to move into Donetsk, that red area, and stop there, okay? And then do the same trick as they did in Crimea, annex it, cry foul, blah, 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 blah. And to a large degree, things would go back to normal. Notice that after the Crimean invasion, we complained a lot, but our sanctions were limited and they were decreasing over time, and there was increased communication with Russia. But what Putin attempted to do is to basically incorporate Ukraine. If you look at it from the Russian perspective, they believe it's sort of like a lost Texas. Okay? And they should really be Russians. Ukrainians don't agree with that. If you have any historical recollection, they were massacred under Stalin, and there is sort of no major love lost between Ukrainians and Russians. So the current opposition to Russia was not surprising from a historical perspective, but was surprising from the efficiency that the Ukrainians demonstrate during this conflict. And perhaps more surprising is the inefficiency of Russia in its actions. And in order to understand that, let me move to the next slide. Thank you. This is an estimation of relative power of the major contenders in the international system. And then the blue line on top is the United States. The red line on bottom is China. This goes to 220. India is now larger than Russia, even though Russia was substantially larger prior to the collapse. One of the problems we have is that we always live with historical memory. So the English are seen as a major power, even though they're not. And Russia is seen as a major power, even though they're not. They're totally, GDP is smaller than that of Germany or Japan, or for that matter, Britain. Their population is slightly larger than that of Japan, but it's declining very rapidly. So we have sort of delusions about Russia being a major power. And what they really are is a society which depends heavily on the production of oil and exports thereof. So you can think of them as a big gas pump. Okay. And they're sort of, because they were moved north, they are more like Canada. So they're sort of a frozen area with very limited resources, which has over-allocated to the military. So the one area where the Russians excel is military. And what they have already done is they have transferred much of their military technology to China after Crimea, so that the Chinese are now building Russian-type equipment, okay? And so in a sense, what's happening to Russia is they, by choice, have become the vassal of China. And when I say by choice, it's very simple. Russia could have shifted towards the West. Had they shifted towards the West and not only supported Ukraine's entry into the European Union, but more importantly, tried to join themselves, which there was quite a bit of support early on for, they would now be the largest member of the European Union. And they would actually dominate the European Union. So I hear all those people who talk about the brilliance of Putin, and he always talks about Peter the Great, except he did exactly the opposite of Peter the Great. Peter the Great wanted to get more technology for Russia, and therefore he wanted to approach the West. What Putin did is he moved away from the West and is now, to a large degree, at the mercy of a society which is less advanced than Russia used to be, even though now it is equivalent, which is China, and it's become a much, much, much smaller partner. And just to see, could I see the next graph, 5, please? And to see those comparisons, look at China and Russia together, and the first side is population. So obviously China dominates, 1.4 billion, and Russia is around 200 and something. The European Union plus the US, it's about a little bit over half that. But look at the GDPs. China and Russia, this is a little old now, are less than half of the US and Europe. If I did it today, the same graph, China would match the US, but Russia would stay the same size. Russia has not grown after the collapse of the Soviet Union. And one of the reasons they have not grown is because they over-allocated resources to the military, and the military is very useful basically for business purposes, but it's very expensive to maintain for a small society. Could we go to the next one? Okay, here are direct comparisons of Russia with its neighbors. Notice that both Germany and England are larger than Russia. Okay. And so is Japan by a substantial amount. So when we think in terms of direct confrontation, sustained long-term confrontation, in a long-term sustained confrontation, Japan should actually win versus Russia. which when you think about it, nobody believes, right? And the same thing versus either Germany or UK, or certainly the combination of Germany plus France plus the EU and on and on. So one of the problems that we have is a massive distortion of reality. We still think of Russia as a global power. And the main reason we think of that is because they have nuclear weapons. Okay. One of the interesting things about nuclear weapons is if you use them, depends against whom, but if you use them against somebody who is equivalent to you, you will also be destroyed substantially. The minimum you're going to do is lose a substantial portion of your cities. It's not a good bargaining deal. It's a good defensive deal. It's not an efficient way of imposing your capabilities. In effect, we have demonstrated that in the past because something called compellence used to dominate when the United States was preponderant. And then we found out that we had compellence and nobody listened. First, the Chinese didn't listen. Then the Russians in Hungary didn't listen. Then the Vietnamese didn't listen. And then we just sort of stopped talking about compellence. And the main reason for that is when you have, if you are going to win conventionally, you definitely don't want to initiate a nuclear confrontation that can be retaliated. Now, when you have a confrontation which you have no retaliation, that's a different game. But in the global context, every one of these members has the capacity to destroy the other. China is not there yet, but will be there in 5-10 years. Next. Whoops. Sorry. Okay. So in order to understand sort of my understanding of the situation, I think most of you are familiar with realism. And realism makes the assumption that in the international system, we are all in anarchy. There are no rules. So if you're stronger, you win. If you're weaker, you lose. Norms are only for small people, okay? And they're not for the powerful. So notice, for instance, right now, that there is an accusation of genocide. If this accusation were labeled against a small country, Panama, Venezuela, whatever, there would be immediately a reaction. The UN would go in, they would send troops, blah, blah, blah. And now notice that the Europeans and the Americans are, well, you know, I'm not so sure this is genocide, but it's, you know, maybe it's sort of misbehavior. Particularly Europeans are sort of backing off because they're saying if we accuse them of genocide, there are consequences for us directly. And notice that NATO says, well, you know, we'll help Ukraine, but we won't help them enough. Okay. So they could basically recover all the territory. Let's see if we can get some adjustments. So clearly power is important. But to believe that the international system exists in this red area at the top is inconsistent with reality. The second point, which is really important about realism, is that they have always argued that balance of power leads to stability. When two very large powers confront each other, they're trying to preserve themselves. So in order to preserve themselves, they look at themselves and say, if I fight somebody my own size, it's going to hurt a lot. So therefore, I'm going to avoid war. What I should do is, when I can pick on somebody who is small, I will do so. Okay, so my realist friends are very, very happy saying, see, I told you Russia would invade Ukraine. But what's interesting about that is when the Soviet Union collapsed, the United States should have invaded Russia. And we didn't. So the search for hegemony, which some realists argue, was bypassed. And that's not the first time it happens. It happens over and over and over. We could have invaded Canada during World War II. and annex it and have a really large United States. Okay. We didn't. So something is wrong with the story. And the reason we don't like to say that is because the world becomes complicated. So what power transition suggests, two things. First, when you are at parity, you're likely to fight. That's why we talk so much about the danger of China catching up with the United States. And the main reason is China is dissatisfied with the system that currently exists. So when you get to be the same size as your opponent, you're going to try to change the norms. And we're going to try to keep the norms. And consequently, you're basically in a constant confrontation over norms. And that's why parity is a very dangerous condition. Because if you're much smaller, you're going to say, well, I can't do much about it. On the other hand, if you're equal, you say, the outcome is 50-50. It's basically a large fight, and that's why we have very large wars at parity. But if you are satisfied, which is that green area, that's when the majority of interactions in the international system occur. Most of the time, we have commerce with people, Brazil, Argentina, this and that. When there are disputes, you try to settle them legally through some legal procedure. It doesn't mean that you are friends. It means I don't necessarily have to confront you just because you happen to be on the other side. And there are other set of rare conditions, which is cooperation. And free trade means I am now sort of lowering the barriers. But if you go to integration, which is what the Europeans are attempting, is the first move towards federation like Brazil and Argentina. So if they were to integrate and deepen integration, that would become one country, okay? And this is the process that previously has been expressed in the international system, usually by force. Okay, somebody annexed somebody else and they kept it. And this is the first time that we basically have it voluntarily. And the main reason for integration is because you have far more influence. So as I was telling my colleagues, if Brazil were to take the leadership in Mercosur, they would be far more influential than they currently are because they would have the support of Argentina and Chile and Uruguay and Peru and whatever, okay? It's a larger bloc, much harder to push around, and you can't separate one country from another easily. It's not saying that you can't, but it's much more difficult. And consequently, you have far more influence. Power is important in the international system. You don't want to always be the weakest link in a relationship. And that reminds me of the Falklands, but I will not discuss that here. Okay, next, please. Okay, and so the first thing we have to talk about is what's the relative power of countries? Remember, I gave you a graph on power controlled for capabilities, political capabilities, how well they're using them. This one shows you the population. It should not be surprising that China is today the largest society, but it's very, very soon going to be overtaken by India. In effect, it has been this year. They're at parity in terms of number of people. And because of the one-child policy, China will dramatically reduce its population in the future because there are very few kids coming into this large grouping. India still maintains a relatively normal population, so they're going to keep on growing until 2030s or thereof, and then they're also going to decline. And interestingly enough, the country which is going to grow the most is Nigeria. In effect, sub-Saharan Africa is going to be larger than both India and China combined by the end of this century. We just don't pay attention to people because they happen to be Caribbean small sub-countries. But if you're going to look at what could be the next global power, that's going to be sub-Saharan Africa. Okay. Now, if we go to the GDP side, notice that the United States and Europe dramatically dominated output, okay, early on, okay. The United States, both the United States and Europe are now being at parity with China, both of them individually, okay. And China will be, for a short period of time, the dominant country in the international system for about 35 years. And beyond that, India is going to start contesting, okay. Now, the India forecast is hard. I simply assume that they're going to take the same path as China did. Some people would say you're sort of too optimistic. That could be off by 10 years or 20, but it really doesn't make that much difference whether it is 275 or 295. But that outcome is very likely. So if you look at the US plus Europe, they would dominate China and Russia. If up to a certain point, if India and China got together, the Asians will control the international system. Period. There's no getting away from that because they have the largest potential population and the largest outcome, substantially. Is that clear? So we are actually in a very interesting transition. This is the first time since Genghis Khan, as VanDyck will know, that societies which are less productive in terms of both technology and overall productivity can dominate the international system.
Pilgrim Place.
By combining. So it's a really very unusual time. Can I get the next one? And this is the structure of values. Remember, we talked about satisfaction. You're satisfied with somebody when they're very close to you. Okay, your values are equivalent, on and on. And they have two values. I have two values here. One is materialist and post-materialist. Materialist means you're really interested in money. Okay, you're poor. You want to make as much money as you conceivably can, and that's what you're interested in. Post-materialism means, well, you're starting to get interested in other things: environment, quality of life, how many hours do you work a day, on and on. Post-materialism only takes place in general when people have sufficient resources to live comfortable lives. And then you start worrying about all of the other things that you haven't done. I put Brazil, this little blue dot to the left. Notice that it's pretty far from the United States, which is moving towards Europe, which is that little green section in the middle. Okay. And the blue guy here and the left center is India. And the red guy right a little bit under the line is to a large degree China. Okay. And looking at this, you could see the convergence of Europeans is somewhere in post-materialism and relative secularity. There's still quite a bit of traditional religious constraints, both in Europe and in the United States. More so in the United States, if you break up Europe into its components, the Scandinavians go all the way to the corner, right corner, right top corner, because they're very sort of not very religious and very post-materialist. Okay, just think of their income. Okay, they're doing pretty well, and God doesn't determine their level of income. India, on the other hand, is exactly the opposite. It's moving far more towards a traditional society, and despite the fact that they are democratic, they are really moving away from Western Europeans. And if you look now at the distances, the distance between China and India is not insurmountable. It's basically a distance of beliefs. Okay, they have the same materialistic perceptions, but they have a very different commitment to religion. And the Europeans and Americans are sort of moving together. Okay. So it is likely to say, I would say, on the basis of this one, that Europeans and Americans are going to be relatively satisfied with each other, which is showing up now in Ukraine. The Indians are going to be sitting somewhere between the two, not knowing which way to decide. And the Chinese are going to clearly side with the Russians. The Russians are right on top of them, by the way, in these graphs. I just didn't put them in here. So since I'm just running out of time, let me go to conclusions. So one of the important conclusions is first, I want you to really think why Ukraine is so important. Ukraine is important because it's the challenge for domination of the European structure, the Eurasia. Okay, and he who controls that is going to control the international system. The first thing is US is no longer preponderant and will not be so in the next decade. So it needs help. Okay, we could do it in many ways. We could do what the Europeans do and try to move towards Latin America and integrate further. But that's a choice on both sides. Okay, you remember, if you don't like them, you can't integrate. Okay. So if you say Yankee no, it's not going to happen. You can just put all kinds of legal structures in, they won't work. The EU plus the US, which I call West, will be preponderant until 275. Okay, and at that point, they will no longer be preponderant. Preponderance leads to peace. So that's why you want to have preponderance. China holds a stability in Eurasia after 2075. They may, in effect, start a conflict before that because they will be at parity with us. Okay, and everybody talks about Taiwan as a potential trigger mechanism and stuff like that. But after 2075, the US, remember, the interests of the Europeans are Atlantic, it's not so much Pacific. We have some difficulties there. One of the things we do know from previous history is that persistent confrontation or a new Cold War, which is what's happening right now, leads to war. And people say, well, the last Cold War was cold. The main reason the last Cold War was cold is because the US was preponderant over Russia, period. The Russians never approached the United States by more than 80%. So they couldn't start a war unless they were stupid and were willing to lose it. That is not going to be the case between China and the United States. One of the things to create stability is to shift from confrontation to competition. Competition is what we like to call globalization. That is, we interact commercially, effectively. We don't necessarily need to like each other, but we use legal means to resolve disputes, which is what we have with Europe. We're not integrating with Europe, we are competing with Europe. The final shift, which would be the one that would ensure stability in the international system, would be cooperation between the United States, China, the European Union, and India. That would be a super majority. And if we could achieve that kind of cooperation, we would have ultra stability all the way to the end of the century. Beyond that one, I don't know, simply because that's guessing beyond the reasonable. And beyond 275, India becomes the power that determines the outcome. If they go west, the West will control the international system beyond 2100. If it goes east and becomes sort of brick type, okay, then we are going to have a massive change in the global structures. That's it.
Thank you, Jacek. Thank you, all the viewers. Well, we now go to the second part of this, which is actually the debate part. I have prepared a few questions, and I'll ask Jacek and add VanDyck to some input, and probably myself. So, Jacek, with power transitions in mind and all the satisfaction, dissatisfaction going on between China and US and the international system itself, do you see if the conditions right now are gearing the world towards a more competition and maybe cooperation between the West and China?
I don't think so. Right now, notice that China has supported Putin explicitly, and India has stayed very neutral, really taking advantage of the opportunity to get cheap oil out of Russia. And I think, despite my protestations, that China is trying to become the leader of the developing world. And it's not that difficult to find reasons to be dissatisfied with the West. And it's very easy to say, you know, you've been exploited forever and ever and ever, and we won't exploit you, even though we will, blah, blah, blah. And also the majority of the developing world is authoritarian, not democratic. And so it's not that difficult to say, we have similar systems, let's coordinate. I see currently, particularly after Ukraine, no indication of reconciliation between the United States and China. In effect, I had something to do with negotiations between China and the United States, and told my colleagues in the State Department not to constantly argue that we're talking from a position of power to China, because they're not. That's, again, delusional. When you're talking to somebody who's your equal, you say, what is it that I can do for you in order for you to do something for me? Okay, so we know that China needs some help in repairing their territorial disputes with India, needs some reconciliation with all of their neighbors over the China Sea. It needs some mediation between Japan and China over a disputed small island. Okay, and finally, it needs some understanding of what's the future of Taiwan. And if I were talking to the Chinese today, I would say, look, let's figure out what is it that you want, because I want you not to support Russia, and have them move towards a far more neutral rather than aggressive posture. But if you offer nothing and you say, well, I'm telling you what to do, I don't think that works very well with people who are A, dissatisfied, and two, rather challenging the existing norms of the international system.
But then let me ask you a follow-up question. I mean, those are highly complicated things to achieve, either one of them. And how will the US be able to, push through some sort of mediation, Taiwan, India, and Japan, when they all have agreements saying something quite opposite? I mean, how will they simply shred the agreements and say tough luck?
If it were simple, anybody would do it. I actually think that the United States squandered the period post collapse of the Soviet Union, and instead of sort of thinking to the future as to where China would be, and try to find effective reconciliation, both moving Russia into the European Union and NATO, which we did a bit, but not really, okay? And number two, paying a lot of attention to China. Instead of that, we paid attention to the Middle East and spent 20 years playing games in an area which is irrelevant to the long-term security of both the United States and the global system.
VanDyck, any input?
Hi, thank you very much, everybody. It's a pleasure to be with you guys. Always wonderful to be with Jacek. Great times, and absolutely one of the greatest thinkers of our times. I am enamored of the ideas that this man has created in the very fine way that he utilizes mathematical modeling to cut through what would say the bullshit and get to real powerful conclusions. I also must say that Jacek's model has been tested by the CIA, the NSA, the Pentagon.
Oh, that's the other one.
And all the other guys, the State Department, and on average, the prediction power of his model is superior to 92%. So it's a very powerful model and a very powerful way to go about solving conflicts, be conflicts between nations as we're discussing, or between different parts to a divorce, or even an M&A. So very powerful kind of stuff. So my input here is that once in a while, and I was educated in part by Jacek to think that Samuel Huntington in The Clash of Civilizations was not fully there. There were many things, especially the formalistic part of modeling that was missing in his ideas. Nevertheless, 2021, 2022, now we are facing a real and present danger in Europe that could become something much bigger, even though Russia is a vassal state of Russia. One of the things that come to my mind is the fact that Huntington predicted that different types of civilizations in the United States plus the EU considered the West, as Jacek has put here, would be attacked by different types of societies. And this took place in the early 2000s by the radical Islam manifestation with the attack on the United States. And now we are looking the emergence. As a matter of fact, we have been witnessing the emergence of China in the last 25 years. And now China is at a stage that it can challenge American hegemony. Jacek, are we entering into a phase that we say, despite the fact that Huntington didn't model mathematically, he was not as elegant as in cursive as we like to see, he had a very powerful point, because I see the world fragmenting definitely in a West that is comprised of the United States and the EU, and you have the economic collapse of Latin America that is somewhat associated to the West, but economically is lagging behind. Those great notions of the early and mid 2000s of the BRICS has really only delivered India and China leading the pack. So Huntington's idea of this clash of civilization is manifesting itself right now. What do you say about this?
You know, I'm not going to agree with you. Okay. First, Ukraine and Russia, if you think in terms of culture,
sure,
are identical. Okay. They're as close as Uruguay and Argentina would be a very good example of how close Ukrainians and Russians are, both in language, history, and basic behavior and looks and stuff like that. So it's a little difficult to say that there is a clash of civilizations. If you go back to my slide number 9, that one. Okay. No, that one. Okay, here are values. And notice that American and European values are close, but the Chinese values are not very far away. So let us ask, what's the difference between China and the United States? We're very secular. We have to a large degree integrated. They're actually ahead of us in terms of integrating females and minorities, except very small minorities that are really abusing, which we used to with our Indians. Okay. The real difference between China and the West is only on one dimension, and that is degree of materialism. And degree of materialism is usually remedied by increasing your income, because they don't have traditional. We actually are much farther from India than we are from China. Now, maybe you would say, well, Chinese have a completely different Confucian perspective, and we have a more individualistic perspective, and on. But it's a little difficult to talk about clash of civilizations. What basically Huntington meant is Muslims and non-Muslims. And if you look at the behavior since his passing, okay, Muslims have been killing Muslims with gusto, and Westerners are killing Westerners with gusto right now, in the sense of equivalent cultures. So I have great difficulty thinking in those terms. I'm really much more interested in the overall structure of societies. That's why I put Brazil in here. It's very difficult. It would have been much easier in the 1990s for Latin Americans and Americans to get together, because they weren't that far behind. Argentina is very close to Brazil, by the way, in this structure. But now we have really Westernized. Okay? We're becoming yuppies, and Latin Americans are not. So it would be much harder today, for instance, to create a LAFTA as opposed to it was beforehand. Okay, and so we really have to think in those terms. In effect, by these dimensions, it's harder to integrate with Latin America than it is to integrate with China. But maybe my value measures are not correct, but they seem to reflect reality a little more efficiently than most people. Now, on the first argument that you made, I appreciate the build-up. Okay, that's a decision-making model, an agent-based model, and that agent-based model anticipated that Russia will only invade Donetsk. Okay. And I believe that the outcome was actually correct. I believe that at the end of this war, Russia will stay in Donetsk and some areas which I've outlined where majority Russian population exists, and there will be a settlement. But unfortunately, I do not think that the West is going to be able to accept that easily, even though if we're legal, if Putin had been smart, okay, instead of being aggressive, the only thing he had to do is start a little revolution in Crimea, then go crying to the UN, ask for national self-determination, run an election, and he would have won, period. The same thing Mr. Xi could have done in Hong Kong. He would have gone into Hong Kong, run an election, 90% of the population say, yes, we want to rejoin China early, end of story. The big problem is that people want to get credit for national integration. And that is really the problem of authoritarian governments, that they do not see an alternative, which is a compromise alternative, which gets them the same results. Because you don't get any credit for waiting for 10 years to get Crimea back into Russia, like happened in the case of Kosovo. Okay, so see the costs here are how you approach the international system. If you approach it as a confrontation, you never see solutions other than war. If you approach it as competition, it takes a long time. If you approach it as cooperation, you're more than happy to give a little in order to get a lot.
Right, thank you. Although I had prepared a few questions and I want to open a Q&A, I'm just going to ask another one. It's pretty much going on towards the economic effects of it. Do you see this conflict moving or accelerating the deglobalization movement? And if so, what are the long-term implications that you see on it?
There's no question that globalization is at risk. No matter which way you look at it, 1/3 of the world, which is China, Russia, maybe India, okay, is going to have consistent constraint on their economic interactions. Okay. And we've seen that beforehand, like the restrictions on electronics from China, on and on and on. So it isn't like new, but this is going to be far more serious, particularly from the side of Russia, and particularly if China continues to support Russia counter to what the Western Europeans and Americans want. And a divided world a la Cold War is not conducive to maximizing growth across societies. So it's not a good time. And I am trying to think of a way in which that could be repaired, but it's easy to have a theory to repair it. It's difficult to implement the theory when everybody else, if you said, well, maybe we should sort of give the Chinese a break and see how we can settle the China Sea. Okay, they look at you and say, which planet are you on? And you immediately are accused of being a liberal fool, and on and on and on. Okay, despite the fact that the long-term implication of not doing it is terrible. So let me just give you an example. Mearsheimer argues that we should now create two oceans and build a huge army. Okay, presumably Latin Americans would be protected. Okay, and we don't let anybody in, right? Well, that's 1/4 of the world in terms of total resources. What happens in the rest of the world is, well, I don't know, let the Europeans fight the Chinese, and Chinese fight the Indians, and the Japanese fight the Chinese, and blah, 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 blah. Something's going to happen, and we'll just watch from the outside. At the same time, the same theory says that somebody's going to try to be hegemonic. I don't know who wins. Let's say it's the Chinese. Let's say it is the Indians. Okay. Let's say it's a combination of Indians and Chinese, or a combination of Indian and Russian. I don't care. Somebody's going to become hegemonic in Europe, in Eurasia. That means, and that includes Africa, that means 70% of the total resources are going to be on the other side, and you're going to be defending two oceans. Hello? You have no escape for peace in the realist models. They used to have one, which was balance of power, and it was obviously wrong, okay? Because you don't attack smaller countries when they become smaller, and you can't be scared of the Chinese right now because they're achieving parity, which is a balance of power. So what do? You invent an isolationist theory, which is nonsense. The problem is it sounds good. Any idiot can understand that. Anybody, period. Okay. I can sit in 5 minutes and tell you you're a realist, blah, 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 you're defending, blah, blah. The security in the United States is maximized because we are no longer involved with anybody else, blah, 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 blah. Okay? That is true and adulterated nonsense, which in effect has been rejected over time, for a long time. What is critical right now from everybody is to make a decision. Which way are you going to lean? Which way will Brazil go? Are you going to go democratic, West, more or less with the current existing norms, which changes, not firm, right? Or are you going to go autocratic and invade your neighbors, just like the Russians did? They're two different games. Okay. So if you believe the Russian game is correct and is the one you should pursue, there's no reason for Brazil right now to be sitting on the border of Uruguay and not invade them. or for that matter, Venezuela. You have to understand, there are two different logics. And if you don't do it now, somebody else will do it later, and they're going to take over on you. So if you don't respect those rules, you can't have it both ways. And that this is a decision time for almost every society because of parity.
But then how does nuke play the way? Because you could try to achieve some sort of deterrence having yourself a nuclear weapon. You could see cases much like North Korea and India and Pakistan and other sorts, Israel in the Middle East.
Nuclear weapons don't alter capabilities. If Ukraine had kept some nuclear weapons, let's assume, okay, would that have stopped Putin?
Probably.
Really?
Most likely, well, at least I believe.
Or
Why
really?
not?
Because I can win conventionally. If you use a nuclear weapon, like if you believe in deterrence at all, okay, North Korea can be deterred anytime, period. Doesn't make any difference what they have. Let's assume they have a weapon that actually hits the United States or something, Hawaii or something. What would happen the next hour?
They cease to exist.
Good. So if Ukraine were to use nuclear weapons against Russia, what would happen the next hour?
5 seconds later, they would have been nuked as well. But the thing is, it's the point of start. That's what I think that there needs to be better understood, is that the other side knows the other side has nuclear capability, even if it's a small capability. Therefore, they wouldn't initiate because they would suffer dire consequences, even if they have secondary, tertiary capabilities of response. So we have the stalemate. What I see today is that the United States alone is vastly superior in terms of weapon, economics, population to Russia. The United States would, if wanted to deploy, not even through NATO by itself, it would send the Russians all the way back to Vladivostok over the ocean.
That's right.
It would take very, very few weeks for the United States to occupy Russia. If you add NATO capability to this would be days. Russia would not be able to withstand 10 days of war with the United States, especially because its economy is the size of the Netherlands and Belgium. So it's a minute country. It would be Russia and Brazil are equal in power, economic output. It would be the absurd of Brazil going to war against the United States today. I mean, it would last 3 hours. I mean, it would be something.
No. It wouldn't last 3 hours. It would last longer. Remember, this is what the Russians thought Ukraine would be. Okay, Russians can fight back, but let me give you an example on the first one. We only have a single example of two nuclear countries over a core contest that went one of them annexed the other, and that is Kashmir. Mm-hmm. Remember, Kashmir was disputed between Pakistan, but actually about 5-6 years ago, the Pakistanis tried to get Kashmir by force. The Indians stopped them conventionally, okay? And everybody said, oh, there's going to be a nuclear war because blah, 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 there, okay? And I said, you must be kidding. Let me go to sleep. And a year ago, India annexed Kashmir. And what did Pakistan do?
Nothing.
They're both nuclear. But Pakistan has two major cities, and they know that if they were to use nuclear weapons on India, they're gone. They've disappeared from the map. So the idea that countries which have nuclear weapons are equivalent because they have nuclear weapons is unadulterated nonsense. It depends how large you are. Now, Russia, if we were to invade Russia or threaten directly Russia, would use nuclear weapons to defend themselves. That I'm certain of. The same way as Ukraine is using everything in their power to defend themselves against Russia. But had they had nuclear weapons, they couldn't use them unless they wanted to commit suicide. So nuclear weapons are not the answer for stability. If they had been, everybody would have them. So this is the one area which I completely think Latin Americans are ahead of everybody, and by far. Regional disarmament, nuclear disarmament, is the only way you can maintain safety regionally, period. And if the Israelis learned that, they would give up nuclear weapons, and then you wouldn't have constant fights with the Iranians. When the Iranians acquire nuclear weapons, as you know, I wrote that when Walt said, please do it, there will be a nuclear war in the Middle East because these people are equivalent. The Israelis have 2 cities that are worthwhile destroying, and Iran has 4 cities that are worthwhile destroying, and any one of them can acquire nuclear weapons to blast the other one out of existence. The most dangerous condition for a serious war is nuclear capabilities and conventional disparity. One side is much larger than the other. And you're losing conventionally, and your last hope is nuclear. Okay. So you let them go, and the other guy counters, and we say, oh, God. And as you know, I expect a nuclear war in the Middle East.
I know. For the last 25 years, you've been saying this, and I expect to see it as well. That's the reason why Iran cannot develop nuclear weapons, because this would be, well,
they can. They just haven't.
They can, but they can't, because if they do, Israel is going to
have the capability, but they're not. They shouldn't be allowed to. That's
but think about, this is the part that I find extraordinarily annoying about American inconsistency. You cannot support nuclear weapons in Israel and deny nuclear weapons for Iran. You can't. So I would deny them to both, and I would allow them to both. Either way. But you can't play this other game, because then you're saying, because you're short or tall, or I like you, I don't like you, or whatever, okay, you can have it. And that makes very little sense, because then it says, if my friends have nuclear weapons, it's a good idea. If my enemies have nuclear weapons, it's a bad idea.
Right.
And we are in effect encouraging Japan to acquire them. So that's a different book, but it's really critical.
Jacek, I have a
nuclear
question.
Weapons do not change the international system, period.
Jacek, I have a question. Yeah, absolutely. Cost of war is a very relevant.
That I agree.
I have a question regarding Putin and the situation in Ukraine. In 1991, the Soviet Union collapsed. Mm-hmm. 6 years later, 1997, Yeltsin tried to join NATO, and the West, we denied Russian ascension to NATO. We said, you are not good enough, you are not moral enough, you are not developed enough, you're not civilized enough to join us.
That's right.
On the other hand, countries like Bulgaria, Romania, Albania, Lithuania, Poland, Hungary, Czech Republic, Latvia, in Moldova, in other countries, all these countries have not only joined NATO, but all of them, with exception for Albania, have also joined the EU. I am not a fan of Russia. I have worked vastly, extensively in Russia. It's one of the places I dislike the most in the world. If I never go back to Russia, I will be a happier person. But I see a massive inconsistency, because we have allowed countries like Bulgaria and Romania, who have the similar lack of human rights record, development, civilization, all kinds of frauds, things which we like to observe in Russia, but we basically pretended we didn't see these countries in Central and Eastern Europe having just as bad as Russia. So my sense is that there is a Russian prejudice that prevails in Europe and prevails in the United States, and we still have a mindset for the Cold War. Then Putin comes to power in the year 2000. And for the last 22 years, Putin has said consistently, you guys are pushing the borders of NATO very close to my borders, and that's not cool. Former countries of the Warsaw Pact, 11 of them have switched sides, are now members of NATO. And I do not want this. And Ukraine is very dear to us because of historic, ethnic, linguistic reasons. This will not pass. So this man has said this to us for 22 years, and we have ignored this blatantly. In 2014, he went over to Crimea, invaded Crimea, and annexed Crimea. He says, and it stops here. We didn't do much. We said, oh, like you enjoy saying, Jacek, we lit candles and we prayed a lot. We slapped a few sanctions, but the sanctions were not enough to stop his aggression. And we kept pushing Ukraine to join NATO with Finland as well as Sweden. And Putin has said a million times since then, and it culminates with the invasion of Ukraine 42 days ago. I tell you, from a rational standpoint, looking at what Putin has done, I might have done exactly the same thing for the same reasons, because my perception is that my physical well-being as a country, the people of Russia, my economic interests are being jeopardized. They are at peril. I think the West has failed to understand the motivations of Putin and decided to ignore, because it was good to ignore, because of the flow of gas. Believing in a completely asinine manner that Putin would not make good on his promises, despite the fact that he had invaded Crimea. So in my mind, this is the origin of this whole mess here. And everybody is, very concerned because of the loss of lives, civilians, etc. And I am as well. But I can detach myself from this situation and look from the outside. And I'd say Mr. Putin, despite the fact that his acts are ruthless, is not totally on the wrong side of this thing. And we as the Western world have failed to understand that this outcome was imminent and almost certain because we failed to listen to what he wanted to tell us. What do you think?
Well, you have, as you know, you're quoting some of the things I say. The United States bypassed an opportunity to settle the international system substantially when Reagan refused Gorbachev's proposal to reduce nuclear weapons in Iceland. That was the first one. And that was a serious mistake. We wanted to go for anti-ballistic missiles, which is delusional. And that's why you don't elect actors to be president. But anyway, that was a major miss, because that would have given trust to Russians and Americans at the security level, which we haven't had for a long time. The second miss is when Clinton and Yeltsin agreed during Reykjavik, Helsinki, sorry, to that Russia would join the Group of 8, which they did, would join the European Union, and would join NATO. And Clinton wanted to do it, except, as you know, Lewinsky intervened, and Clinton was sort of out of the international picture, and the person who took over the European Union was a Pole, and he had some difficulties with Russians. Okay, but we can't put everything on us. It takes two to tango. Okay.
Sure.
And one of the problems is that the more you offer, the more the Russians in effect play games and did other things. Now, the fundamental question you have to ask, and this is a difficult one, right? Our nation state wants in place a norm of the international system. That is, as I said, should Brazil invade Uruguay? Because you can. And if the answer is yes, we're in a very different international system. If the answer is no, not because you can't, but because you won't, okay? And this is the current norms system. That's why I said people who are dissatisfied, which are Russians, which are currently Chinese, and to some degree Latin Americans, okay? You have complaints about this and Grigos and this and that, you know, long history. Okay. So now the question becomes, how do we sort of reapproach? What do we do? Like, what concessions have to be made to the other side in order to make that side trust you and join you? So in the structures that we have built, the first thing you need to have is satisfaction with the norms. We have to agree this norm is the one we hold true. And once you hold that norm, then you say, I trust that you're going to execute. This is why I say the US dual position in the Middle East is very controversial, because we claim we don't want proliferation except for Israel. Well, hello, something is wrong here. Okay, if you're Iranian, you say, hey, what, you don't like my beard? Okay, so it's really nonsensical, and consistency is the essential basis for trust. If you know I'm going to treat you the way I treat the English, you're going to be satisfied. If you think that you're going to be treated differently because you are Russian or Brazilian or Chinese or Iranian, okay, and different rules will apply to you, then I think you have serious problems in the international system. And I think, but let's recall that Russia, Britain, US, and China signed an MOU when Ukraine decided to denuclearize. And they all guaranteed their sovereignty. So not only are you basically violating rules, implicit rules in the international system, you're violating the very rules you said you said. And the same thing goes for China. They said, we're going to wait 30 years for Hong Kong. But then they decided 30 years earlier is okay too. So would you, if you're Taiwan, sign an agreement with China today?
Or to US to that extent.
Problem of norms. You have to have norms that are commonly held and implemented. And unfortunately, we don't have agreed upon norms which are consistently implemented.
Thank you. Thank you, Jacek. Thank you, VanDyck. I think it's time to open for Q&A. I have a couple of questions that I'm seeing here. The first one is, which also ties to one of my own. It's how long can the current conflict last? And also, how long can the coalition, China, Russia, backing up the conflict will last?
Okay, on this one, I have mixed news. On the model that VanDyck has, okay, that's an agent-based model based on the commitment of each party to the outcome. We see a decline in interest in the West over the next 8 months, okay, unless new events happen, like the current disclosure of potential genocide. But the longer it continues, this salience for Russia is higher than the salience for the West. But it's of some interest to notice that the Europeans had very low salience on Crimea, and now they have very high salience on Ukraine. And the reason, of course, is Ukraine is right on the border. Okay. So if you look at the polls, they're at 9. Okay. And the other thing which VanDyck mentioned is, the borders with Russia. It's nonsense to say that, he's worried about borders with European Union, since he has a huge border on Poland. Okay. So this is only for children. That is, for domestic purposes. you can run straight through into the Soviet Union through the plains of Poland, as Hitler did. You never have to touch Ukraine. So the idea that he thinks he's going to be more in danger because Ukraine is part of NATO or the European Union, which is what they want it to be, is a made-up story for domestic purposes in the Soviet Union. In Russia.
So you do see this going on for the good part of this year, and
yeah,
maybe going to the
and
next
the
one.
key question here would be to take a look at salience. And the way you can look at that is how frequently is the conflict reported in top venues? Okay, does it constantly make the New York Times or whatever the Brazilian New York Times is? Okay. Or does it sort of degenerate to the 5th page? And if you want to take a look at salience, for instance, in the United States for Afghanistan, used to be 1st page all the time. Now it's once a week, because I follow these things, once a week, 4th page, New York Times only, LA Times no more, no matter what's happening there. Okay, so that's complete decline in interest in the outcome. Okay, so if you see Ukraine in the top news, both TV and Twitter and whatever, basically communication structures, high, then I think Russia will not last beyond a year. If you see it declining, this can keep on going. But the key to the solution here is not Russia, it's China. If China shifts away from Russia, the game is over, period, done. So if I had anything to say about US diplomacy, I would say don't constantly go and insult the Russians, go and talk to the Chinese and find a potential accommodation that will limit this conflict. That's where the money is. That's where the support is. Okay.
Well, we don't see that going on. So basically, it will last longer.
Oh yeah, just listen to what the Chinese say. Exactly the opposite. Putin is right, blah, 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 blah. And they're continuing to support him economically. Now, we have said that if you start sending military support to Russia, we're going to castigate somehow the Chinese. But frankly, you can't figure it out because the equipment that the Chinese currently have is actually Russian equipment. So the only thing you have to do is run it through the border, and it's actually made in Russia. So how are you going to say that this was previously sent to the Chinese and now the Chinese send it? I mean, this is nonsense. So it really has to be a shift in the Chinese perspective. And my hope, okay, I actually believe that the outcome is going to be Donetsk goes to Russia, and hopefully it stops before Odessa. And there's going to be a settlement. That's it's going to be a lot.
But that's still going to take quite a good amount of time.
Yeah, it's not going to be in a week.
Okay. And then tying to the second question that I have received, and please do ask more if you have any. What are the long-term implications of the war, commodity-wise, economic-wise? I mean, I know that you've mentioned that it's not necessarily good for global growth, but more sensitive matters.
Well, I think that it depends on the outcome. As I said, if China shifts, then we have an opportunity to have sort of reglobalization. Okay, we find an accommodation. If China does not shift, we are getting back into a Cold War. And the Cold War is going to be one in which countries of all sides will have to make choices. Do you choose sort of the Western structure? Do you choose the larger, the growing Eastern faction? So basically the Venezuela choice versus the Chile choice, okay? And but it's going to become more and more pressure on countries to declare. And once you declare, you limit yourself economically because the other guys don't want you, okay? So it's, I'm hopeful that there will be really an accommodation. It's not only a shift by China, it could be a shift by US. I mean, see what I mean? If you can sort of reconcile those two top guys currently, we have a third guy, which is Europe, which is not totally integrated. That would create preponderance. Then you have to bring India in, eventually sub-Saharan Africa and stuff like that. So you could have really a stable economic environment like the one following the collapse of the USSR. But that's just being too optimistic. I believe the more negative outcome is more likely.
So based on your views, you should see more volatility on the markets, high commodity, high inflation, higher energy prices.
Yeah.
Not a nice picture.
Sure, all of the consequences of confrontation. Because you never know, you deal with somebody and suddenly they expropriate you, right? Or your own country says you can't be there. So, well, these are, in Russia, we didn't have enormous amounts of investment. Europeans did. For Europeans, withdrawing from Russia is not trivial. It's actually a major proportion of their foreign investments. Okay. And we just don't like to mention that in the US. But for us, it's the sort of, our dependence on Russian oil is minus zilch. European investment dependence on Russian oil is substantial. So now they have to completely change their whole structure. That's expensive. That's not trivial. And once you do this restructuring, it's very difficult to go back to what you used to do before. But particularly in the level of investment and technology transfers, I am very, very concerned. And those technology transfers started before this. Because remember what our problems with the Chinese were? Telephones, this, that, the other. So that process already has started probably 4 or 5 years ago. Okay. And I see that in our students. We used to have a lot of Chinese students coming. And after Trump, trickle. Okay. Just they're not coming, okay. Which is a pity. Because we're no longer talking even at the academic level. And as you know, I have very good friends in Russia, and I can't talk to them, okay, because they will say, well, why are you talking to so and so and so and so, and they're not showing at ISA and stuff like that. So this is not, once communication breaks, it's really hard to restart it. So I'm not happy right now.
And do you also, some mention that, or some say that there's an opportunity here to maybe change the technology, energy-wise, moving towards different fuel sources and different technology, and then in a way you could jumpstart or at least get back the US-led revolution that it did technology-wise 20 some years ago. How do you see that?
Well, clearly the cost of gas right now in California is $6. Okay, I have a little electric car, so I decided maybe I'll buy a bigger one, and the price has gone up by 30% on electric cars in 2 weeks, and you can't find any. Okay, so I have the funny feeling that if you want a positive sort of push, okay, I believe that the cost of oil is going to give an extra wake-up call to environmentally concerned types, and will make it more viable to move beyond the oil economy, okay, which would have taken 50 years, maybe now it'll take 30. So yeah, there's always a silver lining on everything. That is one. Yeah, correct. Yeah.
All right. Well, thank you, Jacek. Thank you, VanDyck. Thank you all for participating in this debate, watching us. It has been a pleasure. For me, especially, it's almost like going back virtually 20 years with VanDyck and with you, 15 years, when I was sitting on the classroom learning from the both of you.
Well, I'm not sure, but I appreciate being invited. Thank you very much, and I hope it's been useful.
Thank you so much, Jacek. It's always an honor. It's an honor to be with you. Thank you, everybody. Have a great evening. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Have a great evening. Bye-bye.